I'm Claire Hubble, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we investigate what appears to be growing internal opposition to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, get the latest on the ongoing battle for Kherson, and hear from our reporter on the ground in Kyiv, where life continues under constant threat of missile strikes.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Ukraine can win, Ukraine must win, and Ukraine will win.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Wednesday, 26th of October, day 245. And today, I'm joined by Associate Editor Dominic Nichols, Assistant Comment Editor Francis Durnley, and Joe Barnes, our reporter in Ukraine. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Well, hi Claire, and hi everybody. So the big thing from the last 24 hours is the focus on the city of Kherson, down in to the south of the country. Alexei Arestovich, who's the President Zelensky's key advisor, he has said that he's building on the reports from recent days. He said there's no sign that Russian forces are looking to abandon the city, and quite the reverse. He says, quote, with Kherson, everything is clear. The Russians are replenishing, strengthening their grouping there. It means that nobody is preparing to withdraw. On the contrary, the heaviest of battles is going to take place for Kherson. So it looks as if these ideas that what would make military sense to remove those forces, they're no longer providing any real advantage there for Russia. It would make sense to move them back across the Dnipro River to the south, to the sort of southern and eastern bank of the Dnipro. Looks like Russia is not going to do that. Looks like they are going to try and hang on to the city, which could be, if Ukraine wants to try and take it in its entirety by fighting street to street, could be a very expensive battle there. I will in a moment just talk about, just very briefly, why cities are important. What is a city? Why should they be? Why are they held to have such military significance? But just before I do that, other updates. There seem to be signs of potential unrest in the Kremlin. I mean, a very small p potential. But we see some of the figures close to Putin, such as the Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov, who has his fighters supposedly in Ukraine. He has complained that the performance has been woeful. He says that although he's saying Ukrainian strikes on Russian territory have been weak, he's noting that they are fighting on Russian soil, which is disputed. But he's citing that the war has moved into Russia. He's also calling it a war. He's not saying it's a special military operation, and he's basically complaining about the way that Russia has been conducting this campaign so far. And that goes hand in hand with Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner Group, who's also very sharply criticised the Russian MOD, purportedly in a private conversation to Putin, but I think it's been widely leaked. He is apparently complaining that whilst the Russian MOD is relying on groups like the Wagner forces, they are not in any way funding them or supplying them, which again I think is a bit of a moot point, because we're pretty certain that Wagner are being supplied by Russia. But the interesting point there is that these two characters, who are quite significant military figures in their own right, for good or ill, mainly ill, but that they are speaking in this manner. It just shows the internal, what we suspect to be fairly accurate reports, the internal opposition, or if not opposition, that's far too strong, but criticism of the way that Putin and the Kremlin are running this war. I'll take a little pause there, but yeah, it is worth coming back if there's time to discuss urban fighting, because it's very important.
Thank you for that, Dom. I'd like to come to you next, Francis. You've been reading recently about the state of opposition in Russia. I understand you have an update on this for us.
Thanks, Claire, and good afternoon, everyone. Yes, regular listeners will know that I've been keeping an eye on the state of resistance in Russia. And to Dom's point, in the past 24 hours, we've seen perhaps our clearest indication yet that things are heating up in that regard, not just in the Kremlin, but outside of the Kremlin as well. We understand that in the past 24 hours, Russian anti-war protesters have blown up a railway line on the main link between Russia and Belarus. This is according to the UK Ministry of Defence. This comes from a reliable source. There have been at least 6 incidents of sabotage against Russian military infrastructure that's been claimed since June, but this would be the most significant by this group known as Stop the Wagons. And essentially it's an attempt to delay and stop rail transport from deploying forces to Ukraine, and it makes doing so extremely challenging, and that's indeed the UK Military Defence's approach to how significant this is. Bear in mind that the network, of course, extends over 33,000 kilometres, so this is a very, very extensive rail work. But nonetheless, this kind of damage, I think, rather than being seen in its military significance, because I imagine they'll be able to repair this fairly quickly, it should be seen rather as indicative of a ramping up of internal pressure, I think. And whilst this group have been orchestrating several acts in recent months, I think the scale of this one and the timing of this one is no doubt significant. So I think well worth just touching on that. So I don't want to over-egg the significance of it too much, but I think nonetheless it's something that's worth drawing attention to in the broader context of protesting in Russia.
Thanks for that, Francis. Staying on Russia, there's another update on Russian activities in the nuclear space. What can you tell us about what's happened?
Yes, so Russia's nuclear energy operator has said that Russian forces are performing secret work at Europe's largest nuclear power plant, that of course being Zaporizhzhia. Now this comes in the background of increasing fears that the Kremlin might intend to make Zaporizhzhia the site of some alleged false flag operation involving a nuclear device. Indeed, we've spoken at length already in recent days about the Russian Ministry of Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu making calls on India and Chinese counterparts to convey Moscow's warning that it's Ukraine's intention to deploy some kind of dirty bomb, that being a weapon that uses radioactive material. But the fear is, as we've talked about, is that this is actually Russia are planning this and are hoping to be able to blame it on the Ukrainians, even though it would have actually been carried out by them. And as I say, that the update in this space is the fact that they believe there's some kind of secretive work going on at Zaporizhzhia, perhaps to acquire some of this radioactive material. So again, we don't know much more details than that, but nonetheless, it's an interesting one, I think, and worth drawing attention to.
Thanks again, Francis. I understand there's been an update on the US letter that you mentioned yesterday. What's the latest on that?
Yes, well, I spoke at length yesterday about this letter that was delivered to the White House by a certain number of progressive Democrats calling on President Joe Biden to negotiate directly with Russia for a, quote, rapid, close quote, peace in Ukraine. They have now backed down and withdrawn that letter following the widespread backlash, not only from Ukraine, but from the White House and other furious Democrats who've really called their position an olive branch to Vladimir Putin himself. So it's all fallen apart very, very quickly, and perhaps in a way that was to be expected, not necessarily given the reality of the letter, which we understand was written in July, but rather for the timing of it and the optics of it, to Dom's point yesterday, which is that the optics of this were more significant than the context, in that it comes at a time when there's increased concern amongst the West and certainly in Kyiv that there may be, as we approach winter, a weakening of Western resolve, and this would of course play into Moscow's propaganda and being able to say, you know, to the people back in Russia that this is something that is actually really happening and is now tangible. So as I say, I think it's expected that it would be withdrawn, and in fact there is more to this story. As I say, it was drafted many months ago, so it is not actually indicative of any contemporary feeling, and they're now actually saying that it was released by staff without warning, so perhaps even released by accident. We don't know whether that's true or not, but nonetheless, I think it's still something that is worth talking about, because it is suggestive of broader trends, or at least that's the fear.
Thanks, Francis. Now, British listeners will be only too aware that we have a new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He's only been in office for a day, but Francis, what can you tell us about his attitudes towards Ukraine? Have there been any developments on that front so far?
Well, yes. So I spoke yesterday about some of the, I suppose, concerns that he may not be as robust on Ukraine as his direct predecessors, Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. Indeed, his remarks that I spoke about yesterday were outside of number 10 when he gave his speech were not as strong as Liz Truss's had been. He spoke about the war coming to a conclusion rather than saying anything stronger than that. But actually, there have been immediate signs since we spoke yesterday of Rishi Sunak being much more robust on Ukraine. Indeed, he's vowed to support the country and has said that Britain's support will be as strong as ever. And he even hinted about an in-person trip after speaking to President Zelensky yesterday. He spoke in the evening to underline Britain's steadfast support for the country. That was according to a Downing Street spokeswoman. And as I say, direct quotes we can pull from that statement are that his government would, quote, continue to stand in solidarity with the war-torn country, and also noting the importance of the International Atomic Energy Agency's work in Ukraine to ensure nuclear safety and provide transparency around disinformation. So quite revealing, I think, that on his first day in office that he saw it as vitally important to speak to Volodymyr Zelensky first. And I think that is suggestive, as I say, of the more hawkish side of Rishi Sunak, which we saw in his letter to the Kyiv Post to mark Ukraine Independence Day, which I spoke about at length yesterday. So promising signs from a British perspective that some of the fears around Rishi Sunak and Ukraine may not be quite as founded as some feared.
And the only other thing I'll add before you bring Joe in, it's interesting that Shoigu continued his sort of diplomatic round of phone calls about this whole dirty bomb thing. He's apparently called his opposite numbers in China and India, and Rajnath Singh, who's the Indian defence minister, actually gave him, we are told, this is from, I'm looking at the Hindustan Times and other Indian media, actually gave a bit of a stiff-armed response, and a spokesman for Defence Minister Singh said, he pointed out, this is a quote, he pointed out that the nuclear option should not be resorted to by any side, as the prospect of the usage of nuclear or radiological weapons goes against the basic tenets of humanity, end of quote. So interesting there. I mean, couched in nice, soft language, but, by any side, it's pretty obvious that, well, to most intelligent consumers of this kind of information, that it's only Russia who's risking or talking about the use of a nuclear weapon or radiological weapon. But interesting use of language there, that they sort of couch it in the by any side. But mentioning nuclear or radiological weapons, I mean, a real clunky, wonkish term. But I'm directly talking to dirty bombs. That's what a radiological weapon is. So here we have the defence minister of India saying directly to Sergei Shoigu, don't be using a dirty bomb, meine Freund. Probably mixing my consonants up there. But I thought it was very interesting that he goes to China. We don't know what happened there because China and India for a bit of support and gets a fairly stiff-armed response.
Thanks for that, Dom. Now I'd like to go over to the Telegraph's reporter on the ground in Ukraine, Joe Barnes. Joe, could you tell us about what you've been doing and who you've spoken to so far?
Hi, everyone. So here in Kyiv, and have been here for just shy of a week now. And what I've been doing here, and I thought it was important to kind of tell the story of Kyiv when I arrived in Ukraine, because it's been slightly neglected because it's hundreds and hundreds of miles away from any sort of front line. But there are dozens and dozens of stories here. So I think I'd start, and I say this now as air raid sirens kind of ring around the city, as they quite regularly do every day. One of the first things I kind of noticed, and so I visited Kyiv first back in 2018, and kind of became really, really fond of the city and its people, and it's regardless of war and what's going on, it's a great cultural hub. It has great artists, great musicians, great nightlife spots, great outdoor green spaces. It really is a vibrant city for those that haven't visited or been lucky enough to visit. And to start with, I was asked to do the Telegraph Dispatches newsletter, which gets emailed out to our subscribers once a week, I believe. And I wrote it about the sounds of Kyiv's resistance. And it started off, let's say, I was taking a stroll towards Shevchenko Park, which was the scene of a horrific Russian missile attack just about probably 3 weeks ago now. And you'll all be aware of, kind of been familiar with the pictures of a huge crater that had been blown up and made just next to a children's playground in that park. And so I took a stroll there one evening just to kind of take in the local atmosphere. And I stumbled across a kind of a four-piece band. It had a guitarist, a drummer, bassist, a piano player, and obviously the singer in it. And they were playing U2 just to kind of add some more colour to it. But what I kind of gathered from this, and as I further explored the city of an evening and moved round, was that the people of Kyiv won't be kind of cowered in to being affected by Vladimir Putin's slight change of tactics, where he's now decided to start targeting civilians in the Ukrainian capital after kind of so much. So basically, it had been silent here for many months. A lot of the people you speak to would say that war is something that they read about on Telegram news channels or the newspaper or watch on television. It's not something that impacts their everyday living. And I found it really, really fascinating to speak to people about how they live with this adversity. And so during one lengthy air raid siren last week, it ended with multiple strikes on civilian targets across the country. Didn't directly land in Kyiv, but some targets were hit in the region itself around the capital. And I've met a former journalist here, Arena, and we've been speaking, and she messaged me to basically reach out and go, Joe, are you okay during this air raid siren? Have you taken cover? Have you done this? And I said, yeah, we're all safe. What about you? And she was just like, oh, I no longer really am affected by the air raid sirens. I don't automatically seek shelter. And then once the all clear was given, she messaged back to say, congratulations, we're alive. And then she apologised for sounding slightly odd and said, look, we in Kiev are all here trying to find positives in our life. And that's just something I've really found here. The atmosphere has been, it's not one of where a country's at war. It's a story about kind of young people that are really trying to get on with life. And the sounds of the city are very much that of celebration rather than of kind of the adversity of the fact that these Iranian-made drones have been fired into the city, cruise missiles are being fired into the city, and the fact that there's a ground and artillery war, and the front lines of that are, say, just a few hundred miles away. And then elsewhere, I've travelled out to the town of Irpin, which saw some of the most devastating kind of damage and destruction caused by the Russians in the early days of the war. And we visited a close-knit community, a community of 4 tower blocks in Irpin called the 10th Line. And there we met a few families who are basically, they've moved back in, but they're now grappling with the fact that they have no windows. Their homes are still yet to be repaired after kind of brutal Russian aerial strikes on their apartment blocks. So the outside of their buildings are completely like scarred and charred. There's that you can you could see the craters left from the shelling that took place there on the street outside. The children's play park there was covered and littered with holes where shrapnel had ripped through the slide, and the swing was left dangling off. It was really quite sad to see, because it was clearly once a very, very happy, a nice kind of commuter town to live in, away from the hustle and bustle of Kyiv, and somewhere nice to raise your children, with more green spaces, wooded areas to explore and kind of have fun in. But we met one young family, the mother, Yana, she's 28, and she had a young daughter, Ira, who was 12, and they are living, they actually lost their house, which was in one of the apartment, which was in one of the 4 tower blocks, which was condemned after the Russian strike. But they were lucky enough that they were rehomed across in the same estate, across in another one of these tower blocks. But we went up, and they invited us in, and they had no windows. All they had to keep the elements out were these thin plastic tarpaulin sheets. And it was getting cold. And like a lot of properties that have been damaged in that area, there was no gas. So for heating, they relied on 2 electric heaters in the corner of the main room, which was actually also the kind of the main bedroom, because it was a very small and modest apartment. But when we arrived in Irpin at that point, the community had been out without power for several hours, and I think in total was without power for about 7 hours that day when we were there. And that is because Vladimir Putin and the Russian military have started to target civilian infrastructure, electricity, power stations, and switch points and stuff like that in and around these towns in Ukraine. And so basically, this family had no way of cooking, no way of heating their homes, no way of entertaining themselves. And naturally, as winter creeps in, it was starting to get dark early. So they were basically huddled around in their family homes, only with battery-powered torches and the remaining power on their mobile phones to illuminate their rooms. So it's quite a sad existence. And we did say it's on the website, the dispatch that we did from Irpin. And so Yana, it was quite a sad story, really, because she basically had no hope of having her windows repaired and replaced before the winter really sets in. And Ukrainian winters are, as most people know, quite brutal. So they'll be expecting temperatures soon to kind of plunge below zero. And you just kind of have to feel that while the war is actually hundreds and hundreds of miles from them, people are still battling for basically to survive. And that's one kind of takeaway that maybe, and you'll always say when you ask Ukrainians what they want, they're always asked for weapons. But actually, is there something more humanitarian that the Western countries, especially Britain, because in April Boris Johnson pledged to basically fund and help the rebuild of the Kyiv region after the horrible occupations of Irpin, of Bucha, and of Borodyanka in this region. But we're yet to see kind of the real effects of those Western promises, I think. So that's kind of one takeaway. And then I say I've done a few more pieces that are yet to be published. So I've been to meet 2 football hooligans turned soldiers, and this will be in tomorrow's newspaper. And they're members of what are quite a unique group called the Hoods Clan. They're Ukraine's only anti-fascist and anti-racist football hooligans group, and many of their members have now gone to volunteer on the front line, and I met 2 of them. And so the story is essentially about how Ukrainian society has come together, despite being deeply divided before, between sort of skinhead groups, anarchist groups, communist groups, and they found one common enemy, and they're actually now fighting for a kind of a new and united Ukraine. And then another story that I've been quite interested in while out here is and it was going on the sounds of Kyiv, is we visited a nightclub, an underground warehouse rave, essentially, that was attended by hundreds and hundreds of young people. Because before the war, Kyiv was considered one of Europe's kind of premier kind of night spots in terms of raves and night clubbing. But obviously that all goes away with war, because there was harsh curfews put in place, and alcohol wasn't allowed to be served, and people on the front line would fled the country. But actually now nightlife is starting to spring back into action in Kyiv. And we went to one event, which was quite interesting. It was set up by an organisation called Kyiv Angels, who's made up of kind of DJs, artists, music producers, club promoters, and various other people who have been ferrying humanitarian and military supplies to the front line, or the front lines of this war since February. And they had set up a club night to raise money for a car that was going to be handed to a local snipers unit based in Kyiv, so they could go to the front line and be more effective in battling. And we met one local DJ there who was quite interesting. His name was Sasha Schultz. And he had basically volunteered to fight at the beginning of the war, but was told that he couldn't because he has kind of a loss of vision in his left eye. So instead, he's taken it upon himself to do all he can to basically support his country at its time of need. And he's raising money. He's hosted these club nights, these raves in Lviv, in Kyiv. He's hoping to take them to Berlin, to Paris, to London, to Barcelona, to these European clubbing hotspots to raise more money. So I think that's something to look out for. And I'll stop there because I'm conscious I've been rambling on for quite some time.
Fascinating to hear from you, Joe. I just wanted to go back to what you were saying about your journalist connection who said she wasn't running for cover every time she heard an air raid siren. Is that a commonly held attitude from the people that you've spoken to, or is that something that is kind of across age brackets, that attitude? Is it just something that the young people are doing? I'd like to hear more about whether that's kind of a universally held belief or if that's just the few.
No, I would say it's very universal. At first, the air raid sirens are disconcerting. It's something that, fortunately for us in Britain, unless you're of an age where kind of World War II was still going on, you've probably never heard an air raid siren before. So when the first siren went off on my first morning, I instantly went, "Oh, what do I do?" I went down to kind of the lobby of the hotel and saw just people getting on with their lives. But I think yesterday, when it's a Tuesday, early morning, I was out for a walk. I went for a morning coffee and I was just having a stroll, so I'd go and buy some supplies, basically in preparation of leaving Kyiv tomorrow. And the air raid siren went out. I was a 20-minute walk from the hotel, so I kind of started ambling my way back. But there was very, very, very few people were even fazed by the fact that this air raid siren was going off. Yes, shops have to close, restaurants have to close. There's lots of people out there. But I walked past we'll call it a high-end kind of John Lewis or style department store near the Independence Square, Maidan Square, and they were kicking the customers out, but instead of the customers leaving, they were just waiting outside to be let back in. So I think we're at a stage in Kyiv where people have kind of grown to live with the threat. And one thing that was said to me by someone was, look, we would be very, very, very unlucky if we were hit here, because Kyiv is it's a sprawling city. And I just think people are quite relaxed here. So yesterday, when this siren went off, I was making my way back to the hotel with our photographer, Heathcliff O'Malley, who's out here with me. And we decided that we would go down into a kind of a metro station to see how many people were sheltering. And to be honest, there were a few groups of young people had gone down there to shelter. One young girl, probably in her early 20s, was crying at the sound. So obviously it is kind of quite distressing for some people. Another guy that I noticed, he was there with his young baby who was probably less than 3 months old. So you would kind of think that's the wise thing to do. When an air raid siren goes off, you go and shelter with your young infant child. But to be fair, the city keeps moving. It's strange. Cars don't stop. They keep travelling. People don't stop moving outside. People are stopped for cigarettes and just standing in the open. It's quite a strange reality. But I think just the people of this city have kind of grown to live with the sirens and live with the kind of the threat of war on their city. And so I will say something about the sirens. The sirens do go off, and it doesn't necessarily mean that something is being aimed at Kyiv itself. It means something has probably entered or gone near, whether it be a rocket, a drone, a Russian aircraft, has gone near to the airspace of the region. So often at times when I would guess that rockets are fired from kind of the Black Sea, and they travel across the whole of the country before hitting their targets, that would trigger pretty much all of the country into an air raid alert. So I guess people have just learned to live with it. And at first it was strange, but then people would say, "Oh, Joe, you will soon learn, and your body will soon adjust, and you will sleep through these sirens." So one night last week, I was obviously in bed. It was I think the alarm went off at 1:45, and I was only awoken at about 2:45, an hour later, when the all clear message was given through the loudspeaker of our hotel. So what people are saying is true. You kind of, your body learns to adapt and live with this kind of this strange wailing sound of air raid sirens.
On kind of the topic of learning to live in strange circumstances, I wanted to touch on the blackouts. How are people adapting to living in the blackouts? Does it affect how they eat, when they're making plans, things like that? What can you tell us about how people are learning to live with the threat of blackouts?
Yep, so you're right. People are having to adapt. So the Kyiv region, so actually downtown Kyiv, there had been a few power cuts, but it's actually very unlikely that the power cuts off in the main city. But as I mentioned earlier, the people of Irpin, they have been without power for a considerable number of days. And basically the Kyiv region has implemented these energy-saving measures. So streetlights get turned off at night. Buildings are recommended that they turn their big lights off. And even as much, and I'm sure this would probably upset many Western journalists here, our hotel sauna has been shut down to save power, which is quite wise, I guess. So in the city, it doesn't really matter. I've seen pictures of people sitting in bars and they're drinking and eating by candlelight. But as you get out into the Irpins, the butchers, they're kind of the suburbs around Kyiv itself, that it becomes more of a problem. So a lot of these communities have energy saving measures, and often it's for 4 hours a day, or in kind of daylight hours. So between 2 p.m. and 6 p.m, their power is liable to be turned off as the government tries to regulate kind of power supplies and make sure that everyone has enough supplies at critical times. But as I mentioned, that means a lot of these damaged houses are without gas supplies. So people's electric heaters go off. So they're forced to kind of cuddle up under duvets, wear coats inside, have a cuddle with their family pets to keep warm. And then again, the electricity often goes off in the middle of the night when most people are sleeping. So what people have started doing, and what I've noticed from my discussions with people, is they've started to having to plan their meals because they know their cookers are likely not to turn on at dinner time. So they will have a selection of kind of pre-cooked meals that they know they can eat cold and they're going to be kind of edible, because they know they might not get a hot meal at night now, because the power the government promises the power will only be off between 2 and 6, but the reality is it's not always guaranteed for it to return, and it's a sad fact of life that kind of people in this country are going to have to put up with through its bitter winter, because of what Vladimir Putin and the Russian army have done by targeting energy infrastructure, which they would probably claim is a military target. But we know it's actually the civilians that are paying for these sorts of attacks.
Thanks again, Joe. What can you tell us about where you're going next?
I will keep it, because we haven't travelled yet, and I will keep it fairly vague, but we're travelling down south. We'll be kind of in between Mykolaiv and Dnipro to start with. And so we're just going to move closer to the front line, and we're going to look at how the military is preparing for a winter war, and how that they have to change their tactics, what they buy from suppliers, and we're just going to see what it's like in towns and villages where shelling is more frequent. Because as I mentioned, the air raid sirens do go off in Kyiv, but actually the threat of these Iranian drones and other missiles has been fairly low while we're here. So we're going to look at people that are slightly more threatened, or a lot more threatened by Russian attacks on civilian targets.
Thanks, Joe. Dom, I believe you have a question for Joe.
Yeah, hi Joe. Great to hear from you. Great to hear you and Heathcliff are well and enjoying the nightclub. Sorry to hear about the sauna. Just a quickie, if I may. So you say that the Kyiv residents are getting normalised to air raid sirens and all the rest of it. Is there any sign of a backlash against the government in that case? If their new life is one of intermittent annoyances from air raid sirens, any sign that greater annoyance is the restrictions that are still in place from the government, and any sign of a grumbling from society against Zelensky or against either the course of the war or the restrictions that are still in place?
No. It's really not something that I've picked up. And hi, Dom. So I've actually met a lot of people who didn't think Zelensky was a particularly good leader before the war started, but now they've grown to kind of respect him and believe that he's doing a really solid job, which I think most people in the West would agree with. But it's actually, for Ukrainians, it's interesting to kind of listen to their thoughts on how their wartime leader has kind of improved and kind of grown in stature the longer this conflict has gone on. But no, because I think that in terms of backlash against the government, I think the one resounding kind of message that you hear from Ukrainians is they're very acutely aware that this is Russia attacking them and their freedoms. It's not the government attacking their freedoms, as I know lots of people complained about coronavirus restrictions in the UK, and they saw that as a direct kind of government attack on their freedoms. The people of Ukraine and the people of Kyiv understand this and think of this conflict as it's Russia trying to steal from them rather than their government trying to steal from them.
If I could just jump in there. Hi, Joe. Good to speak to you. Just wondering whether, when you're speaking to people, whether any of them give you any sense of how long they think the war is going to last, whether that be people saying that they think that this will be over next year or before the end of the year. I'm just interested in what the general mood is on this timescale question.
Oh, it's a very, 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 very good question, and people give you different answers. I've spoken to people who are probably more confident that the war will come to an end soon, but they are people who are living in central Kyiv. They frequent bars in the evenings. They have social time. They earn probably a higher wage than people out in the suburbs. So then if you speak to people in the suburbs who are actually suffering, so for instance, Yana, who has no windows and is basically contending with only partial electrical kind of coverage, and when she only has two kind of small electric heaters, she was less confident. She didn't know when it was going to end. And I met another lady in Irpin who had been moved to a kind of a Polish-funded makeshift camp, which was built up of kind of houses with containers, and each room had 4 bunk beds, where in this case 4 women would share basically a dormitory. And she had no idea when she was going to be able to move into a stable situation. And she told me that there's no hope for us moving into a more permanent house until the war is over, because no one is going to build houses while there's a war going on. And I said, So when do you think that's going to happen? When will houses start being built? And she just went, I can only hope soon, but honestly, I don't know. So it's a different response with people living in different situations.
Thank you all for your contributions this afternoon. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, so I'd like to come to everybody's final thoughts. Dom, if I can go to you first, what would you like to leave our listeners with today?
Well, thanks, Claire. Very briefly, I just want to leave people with the thoughts about the battle for Kherson city that it potentially is about to start in the next few days. We need to look at what cities are. Probably worth a deeper dive on this, but in the meantime, I'd suggest people have a look at John Spencer. I think he's on Twitter. I think it's Spencer Guard, his title there, former US Army major, now researcher and academic, really interesting guy, and specialises in urban combat, and he's the go-to chap for all this kind of stuff. But very briefly as a heads up, we need to look at what a city is. Cities are centres of population, infrastructure, i.e. roads, rail, port, airheads, etc., etc. They're also population centres, economic centres, cultural centres. So they are very different things to very different audiences. And our recent, as in the sort of West NATO, if you like, our recent experience of cities has been mainly the fighting we did in the Middle East, but that was a very, very different battle than what Kherson looks like it's going to be. That was fighting a counterinsurgency where the insurgents were largely hiding amongst the population. They had much more support from that population. Fighting an enemy army camped inside a city is a very different prospect. So if you think about a city, they just the physical structures of it will break up assaulting formations. So the attackers lose any kind of strength in numbers, which is why they have to have so many more. We say assaulting a position very basically in rural areas is about a 3-to-1. The attacker needs 3 times as many people as there are defenders. In a city, that's at least double, if not many, many more times. Partly because the assaulting formations just get broken up. If you assault a house, that's a platoon objective, a platoon of about 30 soldiers. So that's just for one house. So a row of houses, you swallow up a company and a battalion and so on and so forth. So cities just swallow up people because of the way it breaks up assaulting formations. And that's partly because it protects the defenders, that there are so many ambush sites. It protects the movement of defenders. They can go through the buildings. They'll blow mouse holes through the walls, so they can move from one house to another without having to come out onto the street or over the roof, and thereby expose themselves to fire. They can use sewers and drains and underground tunnels and all the rest of it. So if you think about the infrastructure with underground trains and what have you, it's just a warren for defenders. The built-up nature of a city, it will degrade any surveillance assets. It will degrade communications. So the radio signals do not work brilliantly well when they're trying to wiggle around concrete blocks. And the more violence that you introduce into a city, that then creates even more obstacles, which actually probably benefits the defender, because there are more places to fight from and hide behind, and there are even more restricted routes. So any assaulting formation, what the defenders will try and do is canalise the assaulting tanks, for example, so they only come down a certain number of avenues, so they're easier to hit. As those avenues are turned to rubble, then there are even fewer routes of approach. So the more violence that's inflicted on the city, the more it generally benefits the defender. And the final thought here is I spoke to General Stephen Townsend, who was a US general. He was I spoke to him when he was in charge of TRADOC, which is the Training and Doctrine Command of the US, but he'd just come from commanding coalition forces in Iraq. And he said that for the Battle of Mosul in northern Iraq in 2017, the experience there was that a building of about 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 stories, if it was hit by a precision bomb, it would just pancake. The building would collapse, and certainly the basement and certainly the basement and ground floor, and probably the first floor as well, were kind of intact. So they just made these amazing pillboxes, these great defended positions. Of course, if you're in higher floors or if the building is particularly high, then the whole thing will go. But But buildings that are in sort of medium-sized cities or large towns that are around 5, 6, 7 stories high, they will just pancake when they collapse, and anyone at ground level is perfectly safe. And he said in Mosul, ISIS were just camped out in these places, and it became extremely difficult to winkle them out. And what the Iraqi army was having to do was basically put a combat engineer tractor up front, covered in sort of bulletproof glass and other armour to put up with small arms and RPGs and all the rest of it, and have a squad behind that tractor that would basically go forward into these areas. And when ISIS were opening up from these from the collapsed buildings, they would then have to pop out and take them on. And it was a very, very low level attack, i.e. the comms weren't working. So this is junior NCOs and junior officers having to fight their way through this kind of environment. So an army that thinks it's got loads of generals and really senior people and an amazing kit, rapidly in an urban environment, rapidly comes down to rifles and, as it was in Mosul, flamethrowers. I mean, gritty, horrible, brutal stuff to winkle out those last few defenders. So when we look at the upcoming battle for Kherson, we've got to ask ourselves, well, what is that city? How is it going to fight? Is it a question of fighting for the city or fighting in the city? Because you don't have to go through every single street. It will be extremely costly. So the way that Ukraine approach this city, with all the symbolism there, it was the first city taken. It's the capital of Kherson Oblast. It leads the route round the corner to Mykolaiv and Odessa. It's extremely important to both sides symbolically, as well as tactically. So they're going to fight for this. Whether or not that involves Ukrainian troops going into the city for all the reasons I've just discussed, we'll have to wait and see. But we do need a closer examination on this. And in fact, I should try and get hold of John Spencer and get him on, because he's the guru on this. It's fascinating and horrific at the same time. But do have a look at him on Twitter. He's written a great book. But urban combat is orders of magnitude more complex and horrific, I would suggest, than rural. But one for another day.
Thank you, John. Over to you, Joe. What would you like to leave our listeners with?
I want to touch on, I vaguely touched on it beforehand, about kind of the creative side of Kyiv as a city. And I will try and post some of these on Twitter shortly. But there's been loads of these brilliant kind of murals popping up around the city, drawn by local artists to celebrate basically Ukraine. And so there was one I stumbled across in a trendy neighborhood called Podol, and that was of the apparent ghost of Kyiv, who was this mythical fighter pilot who gunned down tens of Russian jets at the start of the war. There were other ones, say like "Be brave, be like Ukraine," and just there's loads of fantastic pieces of artwork around Kyiv, and I'd kind of endeavour our listeners and our readers to kind of search out on the internet for various pieces of art that have sprung up, and I'll do my best to share as many as I can in the next week or so, because I just find it fascinating that how Kyiv's creative side has kind of really shone and shown out despite all that's going on. It's not the city hasn't let itself, and the kind of the cultural scene hasn't let itself be defeated by Russian aggression, just like its soldiers on the front line haven't let themselves be overwhelmed and defeated by Russian soldiers. And that's where I'll stop here.
Thank you, Joe. And finally to you, Francis, for your final thoughts.
Thanks, Claire. I was struck listening to Rishi Sunak's first speech as the British Prime Minister yesterday at how frank he was about the challenges that Britain faces, whether they be economic or social. And of course, those are challenges that are echoed across the Western world, many of them predating the war in Ukraine. And it just underlined to me yet another tragedy caused by Putin's invasion, just how many hundreds of thousands of hours across dozens of countries, which could be being spent on tackling these global challenges, but instead have to be spent battling against a tyrant's crude, brutal ambition. Now, of course, it's absolutely vital that that battle is fought for all of the reasons that we've been talking about for many, many months now. But I just wanted to, I suppose, underline the extraordinary and tragic cost of that in money, in manpower, and of course in human life, all of those which have been most keenly experienced by the Ukrainians themselves, but of course other countries are also involved in this. And as I say, there's an uncomfortable truth, which is that history shows that only really in times of peace do governments have the capacity to tackle bigger challenges, improving the quality of life and tackling graver injustices. And unfortunately, the longer that this war lasts, the longer the world and not just Ukraine suffers. But it's a battle that has to be fought. But it comes at a tremendous cost, as I say.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. To our listeners on YouTube, for reasons beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear an episode as soon as it is available, please do search for Ukraine the Latest on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your preferred podcast app. Alternatively, you can check the Ukraine page on the Telegraph website. As ever, you can get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. We're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced today by Giles Gear and on Twitter, Robbie Nichols.